So what you're saying is I'm damned if I do, or we're damned poor if don't. Yeah, Sue said, trying not to press me. Sue knew that I was just as aware as she was that if I played along with the plan, we three, or rather our hobby-cum burgeoning computer games company would be very handsomely rewarded. We were talking real money as well, not the couple of £100 or so we had occasionally made selling our games at computer fairs in the past. Some choice. I muttered to myself as weighed up the personal costs of keeping the publishers happy against the rewards on offer if I complied. Although I knew they were there, for a few minutes it was like Sue and Pete had faded into the background as I sat there gazing at my PC until I vaguely heard him mumbling. If he bottles it now, we're done. Not helping Pete, Sue hissed. But it's £500,000, he muttered. Still not helping, she said, now shut up, it's Jill's choice. After being friends for years and sharing a flat for the last two, Sue knew just when to whisper temptingly to me, I know it's something you've always wanted to do. She was right too. Like all long-closeted crossdressers, I had always fantasized about being forced to become my feminine alter ego, and now the opportunity was here. I felt torn between the fear of embarrassment and desire, all muddled up with the fact that if the publisher's pre-release sales estimates were right, we stood to make at least $500,000, and that was a big enough carrot to sway my decision. Okay, I said, wishing the ground would eat me, I'll give it a go, but if I look daft or we don't think I can pull it off, then Pete will have to somehow talk us out of the mess, since he got us into this. That's not fair. Pete grumbled. I did not know Jill was your pseudonym? You didn't ask. I snapped back. And it's not like you did not know Jill was my nickname. He muttered something under his breath and glanced at Sue imploringly. But I sheepishly shrugged. Like I said, I'm willing to give it a go and see. You'll give it more than a go, love, Sue said, ignoring Pete's presence as she gave me a giggled nudge, and you're going to love it because by the time I'm done with you, I'll have you looking like $1 million. Until Pete, Sue's former next-door neighbor when she was a first year in university halls, came on board, Sue and I, just wrote games for fun, and made a little money on the side selling a few through friends. I cannot quite recall how, but a copy of our latest games disc got into Pete's hands, but it did, and the rest, as they say, is history. Unlike Sue and I, who were pure nerd computer science students, Pete was studying marketing and business and used us, as in SR Games, a name Pete picked from our postcode, and our game as the company and product in his final year marketing project. As a part of his course, he had to pitch marketing ideas to real company executives, and after he presented his strategy, one of them commented during his assessment interview, "Pity that SR Games demo is not a real product, Mr. Roper, because if it was, I can think of a couple of companies who would be very interested in publishing it." Oh, it does exist, Pete said glibly. The demo for Wastelands on that disc is a real game that we are trying to sell. With his usual gift for talking convincing bullshit, Pete told them a load of bollocks about how SR Games was a new startup consisting of himself, Sue and me, or rather Jillian, since all he knew about her at the time was the name on the disc information. A week later, a few letters arrived for Pete via the university inviting him to officially pitch our game for publication. Phoning Sue, who like me was snowed under with final exams, neither of us really thought much about it when he asked if we, Sue and Jill, would be interested in forming a real company if he could get our game published. Thinking he was joking, Sue said yes, and then forgot about it, more concerned with getting good degrees than selling games. That lasted until he phoned back a week or two later after meeting the interested companies. Sue took the call, and all I can recall is the look on her face when she put the phone back on the hook and told me, "Peter, that mate of mine from Halls, says he can sell our Wasteland game to any of the big players for big player money." "What did you say?" "Sell it, of course," she said. Idiot. We both completely forgot about one pretty important issue. Having lost my parents, I was on income support in place of parental contributions to top up my student grant, and when Sue and I started selling our games, I was more than a little worried about the authorities discovering my undeclared income. Knowing that I could not afford to lose my top-up finances, it seemed like a good idea at the time to encode the author information for me under a pseudonym. As much for the thrill of seeing the name on the discs, I decided to use my bulletin board crossdresser identity, Jillian Gregory. When we started writing together, I was very much closeted with my dressing and was completely oblivious to the fact that not long after we started sharing the flat, Sue had guessed that I was a crossdresser. Even though she was often tempted to say something, she never let on to me that she knew I was a tranny until she saw the author information. I tried to bullshit my way out of it, explaining the name off as a dodge for taxman, but Sue just grinned at me knowingly and said, "You're an appalling liar, you know, Jill." From then on, all she called me was Jill, and later that evening, aided by the beer we bought with our earnings, I admitted the truth. Trying to explain that dressing as Jill was just something I did to relax when I was stressed was one of the hardest things I have ever had to do. As we spoke, Sue told me that she was very curious to see what I looked like as Jill, but the look of horror on my face was all the evidence she needed to understand that I was far too ashamed of my kink to dare show her. Although she was a little disappointed, Sue understood my reticence, and apart from referring to me as Jill, she let the matter drop, probably because the conversation led to the sequence of ideas which grew into Wasteland, our first commercial game. I first met Pete at a union party when he came over to ask Sue about something, and without thinking she introduced me as Jill, adding it was a nickname. Pete was a nice enough bloke, if a little too silver spoon for my tastes, but he was canny enough company, and it was pretty clear that he was the sort of alpha personality destined for the top in whatever profession he went into. Relishing the challenge of selling our game, Pete, who still had not worked out that I was Jillian, kept us informed of where he was up to as the negotiations with the various publishers. I thought that at first he was just playing until he called to tell us that things were getting really serious now. He had managed to get a bidding war going between two of them. He was in hog heaven, and I suppose for him it was kind of like all his Christmases had come at once as the two companies vied for our signature. Ever the salesman, during his opening pitches with the various suitors, he made them aware of the marketing advantages of a game created by two girl nerds, and the presentations seemingly made it perfectly clear to the interested publishers that we, Sue and I, would be willing to do publicity. As the negotiations reached the point of contracts, Pete had to get our signatures, and so he came round the flat. Before he was even through the door, her was chattering away at 100 miles an hour, and eventually asked Sue as he followed her into the front room, "Hey Sue, can you get hold of Jillian? I need both of you to look at some papers." "Air she not here just now?" Sue prevaricated. "Well, bloody get her," Pete said impatiently. "And please don't tell me she's fucked off home already, as I've got us the deal of century, but to pull it off we have to get things moving today." "No, she's not gone home," she said. "Well, phone her," Pete said, wondering what was going on when Sue glanced at me, and I went bright red, realizing that I better come clean, and admitted. Well, the thing is, I'm Jillian, Pete, hence my nickname Jill." "You what?" Pete said, going white with horror. "Jill Gregory is me." I blushed, as Sue jumped in to protect me. "Jim writes under a feminine pseudonym of Jillian." "Why on earth?" Pete said, collapsing back onto our sofa, shocked. "Would he do that?" Before wailing helplessly, "But the publishers think SR is just a couple of nerd birds and me." "Well, it is kind of," Sue said, looking at me, asking me, "Should I tell him?" Blushing brightly, I nodded, as she added, "Well, you see, Jim's a CD, and as he does his best work as Jill, it was only fair to use her name on the disc." "CD?" For a moment he looked blank until I croaked, "I'm a crossdresser, Pete." Swearing under his breath, Pete reined in his annoyance. He needed both our signatures on the contract and partnership documents he had from the bank, and losing his temper was not going to get them. As he explained why we needed to be in a partnership, it was pretty clear from his expression that he was not happy about our revelation, but after he had been talking for a few minutes he said with a sudden grin at me, "Jill, huh? Well, I guess I can work with that." "Good." Sue grunted with a relieved expression on her face. "Now what gotta be in your bonnet enough to come charging round here like your arse is on fire?" They made me an offer. We could see he was working up to it, and when he did I wanted to scream with delight. For an exclusive 3-game deal, they're offering us a $25,000 signing fee, plus $100,000 for the publication rights to Wasteland. Sue and I sat stunned as Pete went on to say, with a 15% royalty on the first 100,000 units and up to 35% if it sells the anticipated 500,000 units the publisher wants for an opening production run, which by my reckoning means we stand to make, and Pete was off, tossing 6-figure amounts around like sweeties. Needless to say, being two poverty-stricken students, we were more than willing to sign the paperwork that took us into business with Pete as SR Games. With the partnership paperwork done, Pete filed the papers with the local business advisory service and was on the train back to London the following day. Having legally registered SR Games as a partnership, he was now able to sign the contracts in our absence that took SR Games into a publishing deal. As the peak selling time for computer game sales was Christmas, the company wanted to release at the start of December, so it coincided with the London Computer Show at Earl's Court, which meant they wanted the demo version ASAP and the full game's masters to them by the end of September at the latest. Even though the game was complete, it was not formatted or set up for publishing, which meant Sue flung herself into a flurry of recoding. Since we wrote it, we had refined various elements which needed to be formatted into the game before she added the publisher's logos and opening animations to the master disc. While Sue was busy with the coding the master, I basically rewrote the demo version in under a month and passed it on to Pete so he could get it to the publishers in mid-August. With the demo done and Sue going great guns with the master coding, I was able to completely overhaul the rendering, game notes and background information before spending an evening arguing with Pete about the text of the company information in the marketing blurb. Pete was in favor of more rock and roll edge to the blurb, while I was more for keeping things simple, or as he put it, the keep them curious and they'll come back for more approach. In the end, after more than a little bickering, we settled on SR Games was formed over a few beers in a Sunderland bedsit by Peter Roper, marketing and management, Susan Willows, lead programmer, and Gillian Gregory, story, design and rendering. Within 6 weeks, the demo was on the best-selling gaming magazine's cover disc, and then things went a little crazy. Although SR Games technically existed, Pete was kept incredibly busy making us into real company with VAT registrations, bank accounts, and arranging a small business startup grant, which got Sue and I a pair of spiffing top-of-the-line PCs, while we finalized the publication version of our game. When I look at it now, it seems incredible to me that something quite so crude ever made the bestsellers charts, but in the world before 3D graphical cards and high-speed processors with gigabytes of RAM, what we had created turned our world upside down. With all the madness of getting the business going, the issue of me being Jillian kind of slipped our minds until all of a sudden we were just a fortnight from the launch and the train tickets, hotel reservations and program arrived. Chortling over the first class for everything booking, it suddenly occurred to Pete that he needed to produce both of his girls at the official release, which is how I came to make the decision that would change my life. "I'll have you looking like $1 million. I'll settle for passable, Sue," Pete said with a look of relief. "And we've only got 13 days before we have to be on that train to London." "Oh, I'll make Jill more than passable," Sue said with a confident grin. "Hell, by the time I am through, her late mother won't recognize her." Unknown to Sue and I, Pete, having spent most of the last 6 months completely immersed in the business side of the quickly expanding games industry, had already seen a great way out if I got busted, but aware that I would probably freak out if he mentioned it, sensibly kept his mouth shut. "Right then," Sue said, laying down the law, "I want you." She looked at Pete, who had pretty much taken over the kitchen table with his paperwork. "Out of here until Monday night." Jill will have enough to worry about without you making things even harder. Fair enough, Pete nodded. I'm away touring retail outlets for most of next week anyway. And we'll need access to 10 grand of company money, and don't worry, she added, looking at his strangled expression. I won't spend anything like that much, but I don't want to be worrying about not having enough money while I'm doing this. Why? Pete asked. So much? Christ, men. Sue grumbled, have you any idea how much it costs to get your hair and nails done these days? And that's before we get into Jill's outfits, accessories, and the rest. Nope. Pete cheerfully said. And I'm surprised you do. Sue ignored the comment and snapped. Look, we can't just dress Jill in a skirt and expect her to pass as a woman. To have a chance, Jill's going to have start now and spend all day every day and roll until we leave. All of it? I squeaked, feeling both alarmed and excited. All of it. In next to no time I've got to get you used to acting differently, walking differently, and most of all viewing the world and being treated differently. Now I know a few people who can help me with some of that, and the hair, makeup, and clothing just takes money, but the mental side, the body language, so to speak, will only come with experience of being perceived as a girl, which means you need to live as a girl. Oh my! I gasped, unable to hide the smile of anticipation. When do we start? That's the spirit, Jill. Pete said. Just think about that $500,000 in the bank. Now what sort of look do you need her to have, Pete? Sue said, gazing intently at me, because I haven't got time to do much more than get Jill confident enough to pull of any more than a shy student look. That will do, Pete said. They aren't expecting a pair of photo whores. Sue nodded, weighing up his words before saying to me, you bath now, and shave your arms, legs, armpits, and chest if it needs it. Reaching forward, she ran her hand over my cheeks and chin, commenting with a nod of her head, thank God you don't need to shave your face yet. I was not sure how to respond to that, but before I could come up with something, Jill had turned back to Pete and asked him to run through the launch program, so she knew the sort of things she was going to have to get me ready for. Let me see, we have a 10:30 a.m. train booking which will get us into London for 1.30. At 3 p.m. we're launching the game at Earl's Court, followed by a press interviews and then dinner with the Pearson's digital media staff back at the hotel that evening. Saturday morning just says publicity, and we're down for 2 meet and greet sessions that afternoon on the Pearson's stand at Earl's Court, which means you'll have time to take a look round and see what our competition have on offer. And Saturday night? Sue asked. Well, it says TBA, but that's the night of UK Games Association Awards dinner, and we're not members, so unless Pearson's can add us to their group we should be free. Jill nodded, so best be prepared for a business dinner, and maybe a formal, right? Noticing me still lurking by the door to the bathroom, she looked me in the eyes and said, pointing to the stairs behind me. Still here. When Jill get her bossy head on, it was better to just get on with what she wanted, and with a nodded, okay, I headed off to the bathroom, hearing her call out. If you look in the cabinet, there should be some of my shaving foam and shaver. Oh, and use my body wash as well. It's that Body Shop stuff Mum got me. As I closed the bathroom door, I heard her snap at Pete, anything else I need to know? Not much later, when I was in a bath full of water, Sue banged on the door and asked where I kept my girls' clothes. It was decision day, and although she had known for well over a year I was a dresser, I still had never actually shown her what I looked like as Jill, and I probably sounded like a scalded cat when I said semi-excitedly, "Case under my bed." Like most closeted crossdressers living in shared housing, I did not girl shave because dressing for me at that time was a once-in-a-blue-moon opportunity, so there was something all rather thrilling about Sue's forceful instructions to shave my body. Being normally a shower person, it was rather nice to wallow in the highly scented bath and pretend to be one of the girls in a ladies' shaving advert as I carefully removed all the body hair I could reach. Even more thrilling was how sensitive my skin felt when I sheepishly walked out of the bathroom wearing a towel. Giving me a grin, Sue ignored my squeak of horror as she stripped me of the towel and retied it above my nipples, saying cheerfully, "You're a girl from now on, and girls tie towels above their boobs, even if they are flat-chested like you, Jill." Giggling excitedly as she fixed my towel, she nodded at my groin. "Nice to see you're enjoying this." Which had me blushing like mad as she slapped my arse and told me to change into the clothes on my bed, adding, "Oh, and don't bother trying to do anything with your hair or makeup just yet. I want to see how you look naturally before I give you a quick makeover." Except for my own high heels, tights, panties, and my home padded bra, the clothes that Sue had laid out for me consisted of one of her cotton hangover skirts and a pink university sweatshirt. Feeling a mix of anxiety, fear of ridicule, and undeniable excitement, I crossed my fingers and said, walking from my room, "Well?" Sue clicked her tongue, looking at me, and said with a pleased, surprised smile, "Not bad, Jill, not bad at all." Beckoning me forward, she spun her finger indicating I should turn round. "You're slim enough to look right, and even in 3-inch heels you're still under 5'10". Yeah, you know, Jill, I think this will work. Here," she handed me a big glass of wine. "Get that down your neck, it might help relax you." It's just as well Sue felt confident, because I sure as hell did not. With an impatient look in her face, she said, nodding at a chair as she grabbed her seldom-used makeup bag, brushes, and twisty hair-curling things. "Sit down, Jill," adding with a laugh as I slumped into the chair, "Not like that. Stand up, now watch and sit down like this from now on." Smoothing a non-existent skirt to her legs, Sue gracefully slipped into my recently vacated chair and smoothly crossed her legs over her thighs, before bouncing back to her feet, saying, "Your turn." It took me 3 goes to do it right, and clapping her hands she giggled, "Get used to doing it like that all the time and every time from now on, Jill, because I'll be watching." She did as well, and there were times during the next few days that I complained bitterly about her insistence that every time I learned a feminine mannerism, be it sitting, standing, or walking, I adopted it. Once I was sat to her standards, Sue chortled as she carefully brushed and combed my hair out. Who would have thought that Mum making me work in her hairdressers as a kid would have at last come in useful? Before I could answer, she picked up a pair of scissors and scythed a fringe into my shoulder-length hair. "Hey!" I yelped when a mass of hair dropped into my lap. "What you doing to my hair?" "Something I've been itching to do since I learned you were a tranny, Jill. Now shut up and let me get on, we don't have much time." For about 5 minutes she snipped at my hair with the scissors, before putting them down, adding in a pleased-sounding tone as she started twisting the foam tubes into my hair. "That should do. It's all level, and that simple fringed bob will do until I can get your hair professionally done." Picking up a pot of makeup, she told me, "I'll start teaching you how to do this for yourself in the morning, but for now shut up and let me do this." Obviously, like all CDs, I had experimented with makeup, and wearing it in many ways was an even bigger turn-on for me than how I was dressed. So I was pretty grateful that I was wearing a very loose skirt and had my legs crossed as Sue started smoothing creams, shadows, and powders on my face. "Well, that's a hell of an improvement," Sue commented after blasting my hair with her hairdryer, removing the curler foam things. "Aw. Not yet, Jill," she giggled, holding me down. "Let me finish messing with your hair and then you can take a look in the mirror." "Oh my God!" I gasped when Sue let me see myself in the mirror and saw a surprisingly pretty girl looking back at me. "That can't be." I did not believe my eyes and actually had to touch the mirror to be sure. "Well, it is." Sue laughed. "And you came out way better than expected. Hell, you're better looking than me." Pulling herself together, Sue said more seriously as she fetched her Polaroid camera from her bedroom, "This is your baseline look, Jill, and what we are trying to improve on." I looked at her and gasped, "You can make me look even better?" Maybe I could, but I know a few people who definitely can. Now do me a favor and go stand in the middle of the room, she grinned, adding, I want a few snaps to record this occasion, and from a practical point of view it will make life easier if we have a record of your feminine look as you improve. Lose the gallows look, Jill, she called as I sheepishly walked where she directed and posed for the picture. I want a nice smile. Chuckling with a snicker of glee, after all this is fun. Oddly it was too. Sure, I felt a little stupid as Sue got me to pose this way until she felt happy taking 4 shots. Commenting as she put the camera down, we'll look at them later as they'll be done developing when we get back. Back! I yelped as she tossed me a handbag. From where? The Chinese, Sue said firmly. Now I've got you looking passable, Jill, it's time for you to face the real world. I really did not want to do it, and Sue knew it, adding, look, going out in public is something you just have to get past, and putting it bluntly, the sooner we start, the sooner you'll get used to it. Sue was right, and I knew it. Going out in public dressed was the ambition of pretty much every crossdresser, and I was no different. Aware that the best way to get me to go along was with logic, she added, look, Jill, the roads are quiet, and an evening walk to the takeaway has got to be a better introduction to being as seen as a girl in public than me taking you into town shopping or to the hairdresser to get your hair, nails, and ears done. Using that combination of logic, common sense, and more than a little of her inherent bossiness, Sue maneuvered me into following her from the flat. God, it felt surreal to be stood on the other side of the front door dressed like this. The sensation of being outside mixed with the erotic sensations of having my legs tensioned from the heels and the brush of my skirt in the breeze on my nylon-covered legs left me feeling like I was both shitting myself and on a high as she took me the long way round to the takeaway. Trusting the heels to modify my gait for now, Sue concentrated on getting me to hold myself like a girl as we walked much slower than usual round the corner to the takeaway on Durham Road. Taking her time, she kept up a ready patter of encouragement, advice, and all sorts of useful information about how to react when we approached people. After perhaps 10 minutes walking down the quiet back streets, we approached the traffic of Durham Road. Relax, Jill. You look great, and so long as you don't freak out, no one will notice that you're not what you appear. The walk to the Chinese was on one level much harder than I expected, both physically and psychologically. As a bloke, I was used to walking very quickly with an unrestricted gait. Even though I had worn both before at home, walking outside wearing heels and a skirt made that unrestricted level of movement impossible. It came as an erotic shock when I had to accept that from now on I would always be forced to walk with dainty, ladylike steps. The other thing that really struck me as we made our way to the takeaway was the intense sensation of vulnerability I was feeling. As a bloke, I could be reasonably confident that most muggers would probably not target me, and if one did, a lifetime of the rough and tumble of male life meant I would have been able to fight him off, or at least run from any confrontation. However, if I was seen as a girl, I knew my chances of being targeted went up astronomically, and it came a worrying shock to realize that dressed in the kind of restrictive feminine clothing and heels that was currently in fashion, if some did decide to assault me, I would be as helpless as any other woman. I was also very aware of the fact that many of the male passers-by were giving Sue and I the look, and in part one couldn't blame them. We lived in an area with a large student population, and as Jim I had done my fair share of leering at girls in the street, but other than one evening, from an old gent coming out of the paper shop, no one took any overt notice of us as we walked to the takeaway. It was weird, I felt like I must have been standing out like a sore thumb, but no one seemed to bat an eyelid to my presence. Taking her time and occasionally commenting on the contents of the shop windows as we passed, it quickly became clear that Sue was not in a rush to reach the Chinese. She timed things well, because by the time we got there I had got over the culture shock of being in public dressed like a girl, but I cannot say I really felt actually ready to go in with her when Sue pushed open the door saying, "Come on, Jill, I'm hungry." Feeling like my insides were twisting into knot, I followed her and sure that someone was going to yell at me drag queen or worse. Actually, given what happened, I half wish it had, as it would have been less embarrassing than being mentally undressed by the two lads collecting their takeout as we walked in. Nudging each other they smirked, and I could guess what both were thinking as they gave us that cattle market look. Sue, who was looking at the menu, hardly noticed the looks, but they made me blush like crazy, which just made one of them give me a cheeky grin. The looks were bad enough, but when I overheard the one who had been most blatant with his trawling look of me say to his mate, "I'll have the one in the skirt," I felt sick to my stomach about being viewed as prey by another bloke, and it left a nasty taste in the back of my throat. Without doubt, it was the most unpleasant part of this first exposure to being seen as a girl. That was when it hit me, the realization that if this idea worked, then being ogled and assessed like that by strangers was just something which I would have to get used to, and for a totally heterosexually minded lad like me it felt more than a little sickening. God was so degrading, and yet in an embarrassingly dark way there was also something intensely exciting mixed in with knowing that if Sue got me as passable as she wanted, I would be receiving such lustful looks every time I went out in public. "That happen a lot, Sue?" I asked, sighing with relief that they had not waited for a second ogle as we walked home the quick way a few minutes later. "What?" "Those lads," I said, blushing. "What about them?" I could see in Sue's face that she was more interested in getting home than noticing what I was soon to discover was just part and parcel of daily life if you were a girl. "The looks and the comments." "Oh, them, yeah." Sue nodded. "Most guys aren't as blatant, but yes, if Sue had not got me to accompany her to the Chinese, God knows what sort of state I would have been in the following lunchtime when she suddenly announced, "Kate can fit you in this afternoon, Jill." "Fit me in for what?" I asked. "To get your hair done," Sue said with a smile, "and don't worry, she knows all about your gender issues, and she's worked on loads of girls like you." "What do you mean, like me?" I asked, feeling like my knees had turned into rubber as I stood up. "Trannies," Sue grinned, "girls like you." Like the night before, Sue gave me time to get used to being outside and gain some much-needed confidence in passing before the bus ride into town, which, putting it bluntly, was terrifying. Thankfully, Sue had dressed up a little and drew most of the looks as we got onto the bus. I hardly noticed her confidently leading me down the aisle because I was too caught up in telling myself to smooth my skirt and sit like she taught me. Surviving the journey without any untoward incidents, we walked round the shopping center for maybe 20 minutes, with Sue asking my opinion of the outfits and shoes on display in the windows. Seeing a pair of very fashionable girls' jeans, I commented that I'd feel more comfortable in them, which Sue shot down with a simple, "No chance, Jill, you've got to be the kind of girly girl who wears skirts and heels." "But you're wearing jeans," I complained. "Yeah, and I can get away with them, you as yet can't. Now come on, Jill, we're going to be late." The hairdresser's was just off the high street, and leading me, Sue called, "Kate, come meet Jill." "Grab a seat, girls, and I'll be with you in a moment," a locally accented voice called. "Do you want milk and sugar?" "Milk, no sugar in both," Sue called, waving me towards a styling chair. Sitting where Sue indicated, I was looking round with increasing curiosity when a very mumsy-looking woman appeared through a door holding 3 mugs, and said, handing one to me, "Hello, you must be Jill." I nodded, feeling like a cat on a hot tin roof, whispered, "Hello." "Jolly good, now I'm Kate," she said, passing Sue the second mug, before leaning against the sink saying, "Now since Sue has told me a little about your background and why you've had to move your royalty forwards, I think it's only fair that I tell you a little about me." With her accepting and friendly personality, it was not hard to like Kate. Looking at me as she spoke, Kate told me how she first got involved with gender-challenged girls as an apprentice at Sue's mother's shop when one of the boys from her day release course transitioned from Simon into Sarah. I'll be honest, I found it a little freaky at first, but as I got to know Sarah, I found what she was doing was fascinating, and when I qualified thanks to Sarah, I applied to go on the list of approved real-life test advisors and then qualified as gender reassignment counselor. Nodding as if I understood what she was saying, I managed to say, "Thank you, I'll remember that," when Kate cheerfully offered to counsel me during my transition. As she chattered away, Kate was full of useful information and recommended that I made a couple of appointments with behavioral therapist in Newcastle to smooth out any telltales before my big coming out. Seeing that she had lost me, Kate explained what the therapist did, and seeing my interest gave Sue the number before asking with a smile, "Now how long have you been dressing?" I told her, "As long as I can remember." "Well, if it's any reassurance looking at you now, I can tell that you'll make a smashing transition, and if you get on the program pretty soon you won't have to worry about developing male hair patterns." I nodded as if I knew what she was talking about as Sue butted in, "Her appointment is the week after we've been to London." "Excellent," Kate said. "If you can see Dr. Wood at the General, he's the best gender doc locally, and as you are already on RLT, he's almost certain to prescribe you a treatment script." She gave me a friendly smile and said, "Shall we make a start? We've a lot to get done." If Sue was right when she called earlier to say that you wanted the full works, hair, nails, and ears, the lot done. Yeah, I nodded uncertainly. "Great." Kate grinned, running her hands through my hair. "Anything in mind for this?" I sort of shrugged and looked at Sue in the mirror, who said, giving me a wink, "Natural looking, but Jill will be happy with whatever you think is best, Kate." "Carte blanche, huh?" Kate grinned. "Well, for one, we need a little color in this. With your fair skin a honey blonde, with highlights, will look really pretty and bring out those baby blue eyes while still looking pretty natural." Kate's acceptance of my gender-disadvantaged situation came as a bit of a relief. I had been dreading being taken to get my hair and whatnots done, and having them out me. The thing was, it was pretty clear from how Kate spoke and behaved towards me that she assumed I was a genuine transsexual embarking on her real-life test component of an official gender reassignment. When we left 3 hours later, I could not believe how different I looked and felt. Talking to Kate had reassured a lot of my nerves, and given me enough confidence to suggest to Sue, "Since we're here, shouldn't we hit Tesco's and get the weekly shop?" I could see she was surprised as she said, grinning like a Cheshire cat, "If you think you can handle it, Jill?" Well, given this, I nodded at my reflection in the hairdresser's window, astonished and delighted by the simple fact the blonde with the long pink nails and double-pierced ears was actually me. I might as well as jump in feet first, as I can't exactly easily go back to gym looking like this. God knows how many times I had been in Tesco's since I started at Sunderland the year it changed from a polytechnic to a university, but this time it felt all very different as I walked in pushing a shopping cart beside Sue. Every time I caught sight of my reflection, it felt very surreal. I knew from seeing myself that being in public looking like I did was so wrong on all sorts of levels, and yet it was also incredibly satisfying to be doing something as completely normal as shopping supermarket with a skirt swishing around my legs to the sound of my heels clicking on the tiled floors. As we waited in the checkout queue, I can clearly recall whispering to Sue, "It makes me wonder what I was so afraid of." "Told you so." Sue giggled. "Oh wow, this is so cool." I giggled a little later when I saw my pink manicured nails flying over my keyboard as I recoded the routine and sent it to Sue's PC. It was the solution to a programming problem we had been bashing at since we started thinking about a sequel. It had popped into my head at the hairdresser, and no sooner were we home it sent me scurrying to my computer. Other than how I was dressed and looked, the day ended in complete normality, with us both clattering away at our keyboards. After a little fiddling, Sue added my rewritten routine to the game engine, and ran it within the very basic environment I used as the starting blocks for the level structures. It crashed umpteen times, but after about 6 hours we got it to run and even managed to navigate a simple box avatar around the wireframe obstacles. You know, Sue said over a glass of wine when we finally called it a day. I think we might have the beginnings of a viable follow-up, Jill. Although we were both itching to get cracking with the new game other than the odd few hours here and there, we did not have much time to do any real work as the next few days passed in a busy blur. If I had not heard Sue on the phone making my appointments, I would have believed she had been planning this for weeks, as first thing the following morning she took me to be fitted with a pair of mastectomy prosthetic C-cup breasts, and a couple of pairs of incredibly confining garments to called gaffs hide my cock. God, it was a thrill to feel the weight of the boobs pulling and sway on my shoulders as my very realistic boobs bobbled around as I moved. I was not as keen on the gaff, but it did solve a serious worry for me. Ever since Sue had dressed me, I had been troubled by unwanted erections whenever the eroticism of being made to live as a girl kicked in, and the gaff solved that problem but in its way created another, as it kept me in a state of frustrated arousal which just made things seem even more erotic. After discussing with Sue the sheer eroticism having to do this, she decided that I should see the behavioral therapist Kate recommended. When Sue took me to see her, I was not sure what exactly I was going to get from seeing a therapist, but in the end it was more than worthwhile as she polished and improved the feminine movement and body language cues Sue had been trying to teach me. Having spoken to Sue when she made the appointment, the therapist also assumed I was a genuine TS, and I did not have the heart to point out her error or judgment as she chided me about not starting my RLT under a doctor's supervision and immediately offered to make me an appointment with the same doctor as Kate recommended, so I was legally registered as a transgendered woman. Hell, it was hard work though. Each 90-minute sessions always began with 10 minutes of dancing in my heels to loosen me up. After the therapist was happy I was relaxed, she would usually spend 10 or 15 minutes explaining the difference between the masculine and feminine way of whatever exercise we were studying that day. Once she was sure I understood the boundary between the male and female movements, she strung everything together and worked me ragged. Over the 6 sessions I had with her before the release day, she covered everything from holding a handbag to getting in and out of cars, always pointing out when and why I got a movement or gestures right or wrong. I am pretty sure that if Kate had not put us in contact with the trainer, I probably could have got through the signing, but there is no way in hell I would have survived the industry dinner dance without giving myself away. The bulk of my sessions with the trainer consisted of endlessly walking up and down the studio between 2 chairs where I had to sit and stand gracefully. If you don't believe me about how hard it was, just try sometime walking up and down a dance studio in 3 and 4-inch heels. As Sue watched and joined with many of the exercises, she made sure that I practiced what I had learned, and it did not take that long before muscle memory began to kick in, making me keep within the boundaries I was being taught. Although she did not spend much time on it, the therapist also taught me a few little voice tricks that, along with stressing the Welsh lilt in my accent, gave me a reasonably feminine tone. It was good enough, but even after hours of practice I did not really get perfected until long after the London show. Even if we were not going to Newcastle to see the therapist, Sue still made sure I spent a large proportion of each day out and in public as Jill. I needed a feminine wardrobe, and although Sue actually loathed shopping, she still took me round every shopping venue in the area. Not that we bought much at first beyond a coffee, and the kind of essential accessories a girl needs, like a watch, a few rings and bracelets. I don't think I was read as a tranny that often, and after a few hiccups at first soon got used to being treated differently. I don't care what bollocks our political leaders say, there is a huge difference between how men and women are treated, and I was often shocked by how patronizing some men could be. I almost lost it with a couple of blokes who tried to pick us up when we stopped in at Micro World to pick up their in-house magazine, which had a pre-release review of our game. Micro World was one of the few national suppliers that had survived from the early '80s micro boom and was unashamedly a gamer's outlet. Being honest, it was not the kind of computer shop either of us would usually bother with, being aimed at the user end of the market, but they had, according to Pete, been one of the big pre-orders, so we wanted to check them out. Giving us really oily smiles, the salesman closed in on us like we were a pair of apples ripe for the plucking. It was really annoying to be treated like a dumb blonde as they tried to patronize us with their superior knowledge, and I could tell Sue was equally annoyed by it. Knowing what Sue was like with men, I was expecting her to rip the a pair of them second pair of arseholes, but unusually she just giggled flirtatiously. I felt her gently squeeze my arm when she felt my temper bubbling. Giving me a sly smile, she flirted with them in a very un-Susanish way until I eventually worked out that she was flirting with them for my benefit. Tapping the advert for Wastelands once she knew I was aware of what she was doing, she said, "Oh, is this any good?" "The demo was fantastic," the taller of the two said, "and we're expecting it to be one of the Christmas hits." "Oh, do you think so?" Sue said airily, giving me a naughty grin as the other one commented that our game was from a locally based company and might interest us as it was written by a couple of student girls from Sunderland. With a decidedly superior note in his tone, his mate chipped in. "We had marketing manager of SR in the other day," he gave us a smile. "And I asked him to see if he could get the writers into the shop. If they do, why don't you come along?" Sue still had that naughty look in her eyes as she flicked her hair back at him. "Maybe we will." Her eyes twinkled with humor as she added, looking at me, "I wonder why Pete hasn't mentioned it to us, Jill." I clearly saw the salesman looking confused. "He probably forgot, Sue," I shyly said. "You know what Pete's like." "Oh," Sue said as if she just noticed the guy's expressions. "Didn't you know, Jill and I wrote it?" Leaving them with their jaws on the floor, Sue picked up the magazine and led me out, chuckling as we got back onto the high street. That was fun. Looking at it now, I can see how Sue carefully, and probably on the advice of Kate or the therapist, stepped up my time and activities in public. It worked as well because by the end of the first week she had familiarized me with being in public as a woman, and then when she was confident I would not give myself away, took me shopping with the intention of finding something. The first major purchase was something we both needed, and Sue settled on a pair of similar but not matching dark blue business suits, with nice satin blouses, pink for me and red for her, and blue 2-inch heel court shoes, so we had something professional looking for the formalities of the release. As usual for Sue, she opted for a pantsuit, but gave me no choice in the matter when she told the sales assistant that I would take the skirted version. After seeing my trainer for my 5th therapy session on the Monday before the launch, I was feeling pretty confident and mentioned to Sue that I had seen a dress I liked in New Look. "Want to go and try it on?" she asked. "Yes." I grinned excitedly. "If we've time?" "They're not bringing the new machine until later, so we've time," Sue said, leading me towards the shop. After a week of living and being out in public as a girl, many of my male taboo inhibitions had started to come down, and I was really starting to enjoy the experience. It no longer felt odd or wrong to find myself commenting to Sue that I thought such and such was pretty, or holding something against me and asking if she thought it would suit me. Hell, for a previously very closeted crossdresser, I was in heaven and had started to ask myself why I never had the courage to go out dressed as a girl before. My only real worry as we got home was how Pete was going to react when he saw me that evening, and I was getting into a bit of a tiz about it when the doorbell rang. As Sue was swearing at a line of code she was struggling with, I answered it, and the expression on Pete's face when I let him in the flat was a picture. "Fuck me." "Jill," he gasped, looking at me with a shocked expression as I said in my carefully practiced feminized voice. "Hi, Pete," adding with a giggle, "Well, will I do?" "Do?" he gawked, "Bugger me. You'll more than do. What do you want?" Sue growled from behind her computer when he bounded into the front room like he owned the place. "I said tonight?" "Yeah, you did, but I need some papers signing," Pete said, opening his briefcase, before he grinned up at me, adding, "And I've been dying to see for myself how our girl was getting on." "She's doing fine," Sue said curtly, "and will be more than ready by Friday." "She looks ready to me," he laughed, giving me a discreet but obvious ogle before he added, handing me the papers, saying, "Sign these, Jill, where it indicates babes, and then pass them over to Susie." Babes! I almost had a heart attack as I signed J. Gregory on the papers. As I passed them to Sue, I could see her looking at Pete curiously as she asked, "What's with the suit?" "Got to tie up a few loose ends with the bank before we get paid at the weekend," Pete said with an evasive smile. Sue could see he was hiding something that had got him very exciting and grunted as she scribbled her name on the papers. "Spit it out, Pete. What's got you so excited enough to come running round here like you've a burr up your arse?" Clearly delighted, Pete said, "We've already got 100K units shifted just on advanced sales, and that's got us invited to join the UK Digital Games Association, which means we're going to the Games Industry Awards dinner dance." Having been on the fringes of the industry, we both knew what he was talking about and knew it was the UK games industry's big annual shindig, and everyone who was anyone in the business would be attending. "So I was thinking that since we're going to have to go to a formal dinner, how about I take you two girls to a celebratory dinner tonight?" "Make it tomorrow," Sue said, glancing at the clock, "because neither of us has anything suitable to wear, and as we're waiting for the new graphics station to be delivered, we don't have time to go now." I really wanted to go, and Sue could see it when I suggested, "Weave those business suits." Sue laughed. "See what I mean about not be quite ready yet, Pete?" No," Pete said, grinning at me with a light in his eyes that I found really unnerving. If Jill was ready, Pete, Sue teased, she would know that there is no way in hell she would be willing to go out for a posh celebration dinner tonight. "Why?" I asked, wishing Pete would avert his eyes from my boobs. "We don't have a couple of posh frocks and silly heels," Sue said, making me giggle when I saw her pull a face before she added, "And I can't get out of it, can I?" "Nope," Pete said. "Bastard." Sue grumbled, "You know how much I hate all that dressing to look pretty shit." Even though Sue loathed what she saw as the fripperies of female life, the following day she took me shopping and blew the best part of £800 on a pair of outfits before spending the afternoon with Kate getting ourselves done for dinner. "Oh my!" Kate laughed once she had Sue in her styling chair. "You don't know how long I have been wanting to do this, Susie." Sue just grunted, but I could tell she was sort of enjoying it. On the odd occasion in the past when I had been out to dinner, I always felt a little like a fraud wearing a suit, so I expected to feel an even bigger fraud wearing a black halter-necked knee-length dress and 4-inch strappy heels, but instead I just felt awfully grown up when we hopped into a taxi to the fancy restaurant. "God, I feel such a bloody fraud decked out like this," Sue chuckled as we rode into town. "Oh, it's not so bad," I said, grinning at her in astonishment. Sue had always been a jeans and tee sort of girl, and the change in her once she was dressed up to the nines was in many ways even more startling than seeing myself. I guess over the last week or so I had got used to seeing myself looking like a girly girl with my blonde shoulder-length hair, wearing skirts, dresses and makeup. "And you do look good." "Yeah, but you enjoy this, Jill," Sue grumbled. "I don't. This whole looking pretty and feminine lark is definitely more your thing than mine." "Not anymore," I teased. Arriving at the hotel restaurant was all a little surreal for me. Just the year before I had worked there as a pot washer, and I could not help the grin that went from ear to ear when the head waiter, who I knew was right bastard, treated us like royalty, flounced up and obsequiously asked, "Do you ladies have a booking?" Sue gave him a smile and said, "Hello, yes, the table's booked either under Roper or SR Games." "Ah yes, a table for 3 at 9, he said, clapping his hands. "If you ladies would like to follow Becky to the bar and order your drinks, I shall fetch you the menus." I recognized the waitress as a girl I used to have a bit of a laugh with, but she never guessed who I was as she said with a polite smile, "This way please, ladies." "I'll bloody kill him," Sue growled when Pete was not waiting for us. Feeling like I was somewhere between being on display and queen of the world, I tentatively ordered us a glass of wine each and settled into a comfy alcove at the back of the bar. Although I nodded along with Sue's complaints, in truth I did not give a toss that Pete was late. I was having a great time and loved every moment, the specks of lipstick on my glass, the feeling of my tight straight skirt, and a couple of times I almost had to pinch myself to make sure I was not dreaming when I saw my reflection in the wall mirrors. Pete was only 10 minutes late when he arrived with a worried look on his face as he bounded over and apologizing at 100 miles an hour. "What's up?" Sue said, reading his expression. "I've just seen Mike and his boss from the publishers checking in." Pete hissed, giving me a worried look. "Is Jill ready for this? Because if they see us they're bound to want to be introduced." "She'll just have to be," Sue said, giving him a look that said that she would be discussing this with him later, adding cryptically, "We might have to revert to that fallback I mentioned on the phone the other day." "Okay," Pete nodded, winking at me, adding, "That won't be hard." I could tell something was going on between them behind their words, but before I could ask, Sue said with a smile, "You ready to face this, Jill?" Because she did not get any further because at that moment 2 blokes walked into the bar, and when they saw Pete they made a beeline for us. "Peter?" the younger of the 2 said. "I did not expect to see you until the morning. What you doing here?" "Hey Mike," Pete said, giving me a wink before he turned to meet them, holding out his hand. "Just treating my girls to a celebratory meal since we got invited to join the association." The older bloke gave Sue a smile and said, "So you 2 lovely ladies are the Susie and Jill Peter has been telling us about." "All good, I hope," Sue said, holding out her hand confidently. "I'm Susan Willows, and this is Jill Gregory." "Hi," I smiled, telling myself to relax as I shook hands with them. Letting Pete and Sue do the talking as we were introduced, I hid between them, praying that I did not give myself away. I kept a smile on my face and kept telling myself, shy and demure, as I tried to recall everything I had been taught about how to use the language cues that are the gender telltales. I'm pretty sure that neither of them guessed in that critical first few minutes of meeting someone when they fix a gender relationship with you. So I finally get to meet the programming brains behind SR Games, Mike's boss, Mr. Call Me David Pearson said with a smile before asking if we had anything else in the pipeline. Sue took the question saying, "Oh, we've been happily bashing away at a much improved sequel in terms of interface and graphics." "So it's a sequel?" Mike asked. "Only in the loosest terms," Sue said. "Substantially it uses the same basic interface principles, but the game engine has been completely overhauled, and the environment is all new, but I'm not exactly sure what it will look like until Jill finishes the final wireframes, renders and textures." "Sounds like you still have a fair way to go yet?" Mr. Pearson said. "Yes and no," Sue commented. "I've pretty much got the game engine sorted and Jill's done the story and most of the wireframes. Assuming that we don't make any cock-ups, I guess come hope to have a rough beta version running in a couple of months." With the conversation rooted in the practicalities of game design and the game's business, I started to relax a little and even shyly contributed the odd comment about the story behind the game as I tried not to think about the meaning of the looks I was getting from Mike and his boss. I might have been able to look and act enough like a girl to pass, but behind my still-forming feminine personality I was still essential a bloke, and I clearly recognized when another bloke was trying to surreptitiously check out a bird. Hell, I had done it myself in the past, and I tell you now it made me more than a little uncomfortable knowing that I was one of the birds being checked out, so I breathed a silent sigh of relief when Sue said, "Where's the ladies' room, Pete?" Since it was in gender role that women rarely went to the bathroom alone, I followed her from our table, and the moment we were alone Sue was complaining about Pete putting us in this situation. Sue cursed, "You're not ready for this yet." I could see her mind whirling at 100 miles an hour before she added with a sheepish grin, "Look, I guess I should have mentioned this earlier, but I never expected to have to worry about you attracting male attention. I could not just tell to fuck off until the weekend, but Pete and I have cooked up a plan in the event of this happening." And, I said, feeling sure that I was not going to like what I was about to hear. "Don't look like that, pet," Sue said. "It's not that bad, but even so you might find it a bit freaky." What more freaky than my life already is? I half laughed to hide my apprehensions. "Yeah," Sue said, clasping my hand. "Well, maybe. Because the best way out of this without pissing Mike or David off is if you pretend to be involved with Pete." "You what? Why?" I gasped. "Because you've passed." Sue grinned, "And trust me on this, Jill, you're passing well enough that Mike had been looking at you with all the indications that he fancies you enough to try to put a move on, and there is no way you're ready to deal with that, which means like or lump it when we get back. The best defense you can have is to kiss Pete on the cheek and say, 'Did you miss me, love?' before keeping your attention largely centered on him all night." "Oh. Why?" I said. "Think about it, Jill. Hell, until recently you used to be a bloke, you know how they think." Sue giggled, watching her words sink into my mind before she added, "And if I'm reading Mike right, in a situation like this he's the kind of bloke who won't make a move on another bloke's girlfriend if he knows she's taken." "Oh, yeah, well that's true, I guess," I said. "So the best way to get Mike leave you alone is if he thinks you're already taken." I nodded, seeing the logic of the just-in-case plan Sue had concocted with Pete as she looked at me and said very seriously, "Think you can do that?" "I guess." I hedged, feeling more than a little afraid. I was still trying to work out how I felt about the sudden change in my dealings with Pete after the cattle market looks he'd given me in the flat the afternoon before. Sue nodded, adding, "Sure?" "Not really," I said honestly, "but I'm just going to have to manage." Oddly, our deception worked perfectly, and I quite clearly saw Mike's lucky sod nod of approval at Pete as I clacked back and kissed him on the cheek, saying as I sat, "Did you miss me?" Giving me a cat's got the cream smile, Pete said, "I always miss you, babes, you know that," and plumped his hand on my thigh in that masculine possessive way. I'll be honest, for a split second it freaked me out as it felt really unnatural, but at the same time it also felt kind of nice. David dominated the conversation, which suited me, and other than when I was asked a direct question I was mostly able to keep it shyly to myself and let Sue and Pete do most of the talking for me. Although the meal started out with me absolutely terrified, by the end of the night I had learned two important lessons, one that I was able to pass convincingly and the second came from watching Sue's masterclass in flirting as she had Mike and his boss eating out of the palm of her hand before we finished the first course. I even managed to make a blushing joke about suspecting that Pete had taken us to dinner that night to make sure we did not make fools of ourselves at the formal awards dinner the following weekend, which got a laugh and probably a brownie point or two for Pete. After I made the quip I saw David Pearson nod approvingly at Pete, who had the good manners to look embarrassed as he said, "Guilty," and admitted that he had taken the opportunity of using the association invite to make sure his girls would not show themselves up at the weekend. With a laugh he took hold of my hand and said to David, "Our Jill's always been able to read my every motivation." It must have been pretty clear to David and Mike that Pete, with his upper-middle-class upbringing, grammar school education and background in business and marketing, was quite a home with the posh formalities of our soundings. It was probably equally clear that Sue and I lacked his level familiarity with formal etiquette, and were essentially just the couple of girl nerds Pete had described. For me, the main thing that got me through the night without giving myself away was down to how Pete acted like the perfect gentleman when it came to his performance as my boyfriend. It was pretty clear that he and Sue had discussed how he was to play it, and although I was not keen on the idea, I did find pretending to be his girlfriend actually made the whole evening a lot more comfortable for myself, which when I thought about it was kind of freaky. The wine probably helped me because by the end of the meal I had relaxed into being Jill to the point that I did not find it particularly shocking when both Mike and David gave me a very European farewell kiss before Pete let us out with his arm firmly wrapped around my nipped-in waist. "Well, that went better than I expected," Sue said, as we walked towards our waiting taxi. "You two were terrific, and I am damned sure no one in that restaurant had the slightest inclination that you were not the couple you appeared. All in it was a very successful evening, and it set the tone for the next few days. Other than nipping to the corner shop for the first time on my own, which was both thrilling and scary, the only other thing on the timetable was a Wednesday afternoon trip into Newcastle to see the therapist for a final polish. After the madness and changes in my life over the last week or so, it was really nice to just get back to something resembling normality and spend some time on the follow-up game. Although normality was hardly the way to describe life if you are living as a member of the opposite gender, and yet that alteration no longer felt abnormal. I had got used to being Jill, and I was starting to find I was no longer feeling there was anything usual about living as her, which was on the odd occasions when I thought about it very weird. "I think we might have to find a bigger place," Sue had dryly commented on the Monday afternoon when we were setting up the high-end graphics station that was going to be my new main work machine. Although we had only upgraded from our old home-built computers to the top-of-line machines a few months earlier, we needed a dedicated graphics station to speed up the time it was taking to build the gaming environments, but the addition of a third PC in the lounge, along with one of our old machines for Pete on the kitchen table, meant that SR Games had pretty much taken over our front room and kitchen. "Tell Pete," I giggled, delighted by my new toy, commenting, "this will make things so go much faster." "Yeah," Sue said, looking at me strangely. "What?" I asked. "Nothing, just thinking," she said dismissively. I could tell it was something important, but with Sue, if she's not ready to say something, she won't, and nothing on the earth will make her. I caught sight of the strange expression on her face on and off over the next 48 hours, but as we were up to our necks with Game 2 and trying to pack for London, I had neither the time or the inclination to find out what was troubling her. Pete, who unless he had work to be done was at Sue's instance still keeping his distance from the flat, arrived with his weekend case on Thursday night, clutching a bottle of bubbly and a Chinese. Over the fizzy wine and the takeaway, Sue mentioned that she hated eating her dinner balanced on her knee, which got us discussing the pros and cons of finding real business premises, and the idea really fired Pete, who was getting a little frustrated about having all the business paperwork scattered between the flat, his bedsit, and his car. "I'll go see the business advisor at the advice center and see what's on offer," Pete commented when we came to an agreement that we should find something more official than the flat as a company HQ. After clearing the plates away, I came back in to hear Pete chattering excitedly about the weekend's events. I pulled a face at Sue and grumbled, seeing she had nicked the single chair I had vacated to wash up. "Will you be in my grave as quick?" I teased as I slipped onto the sofa beside Pete without thinking about how I had automatically smoothed my skirt and crossed my legs. "Probably not," Sue grinned, "but you two need to get used to automatically choosing to sit beside each other, and acting like you're a couple." "What?" Pete grinned, and promptly slipped his arm round my shoulder. "Like this, you mean?" "Yeah, just like that," Sue said, nodding with a serious light in her eyes. "But closer, you should be leaning into Pete's body with his arm cradling you, Jill." I did as Sue asked, feeling a little uncomfortable but seeing the logic of what she was saying when Pete added, "The main danger for us in terms of Jill giving the game away will be when she has to deal with someone amorous." If Mike and David's reactions were anything to go by, I think we can take it for granted that the pair of you are going to attract attention just because you're girls, he chuckled. "Perhaps I should have brought a big stick to beat them off." "Yeah, good point, Pete," Sue nodded, "but big sticks are not the answer." For a split second she mulled over the idea and then looked at us both before grinning. "I think you'd both best spend the rest tonight seriously practicing being a couple." "Fair enough," Pete said before I had a chance to open my mouth. Taking my acceptance as read, Sue spent the rest of the evening concentrating on getting us acting like a couple. As with every other part of my feminine training, she was being a stickler for detail, and spent the next hour or so instructing Pete and I on how she wanted to see us behaving with each other. She even went as far as sticking the CD player on and having us dance with each other to both fast and slow numbers until she was satisfied that we could look the part. Sue grunted as we danced. If we had time, I think I'd take the two of you down the town to Bourbon Street because you're both very stiff, but if anyone asks, you've just got together, okay? You pretty much gave them that impression anyway the other night, so it should fly if you act like you're a couple in love. So I want to see hugs and kisses between you when you see each other, and when we're officially launching, hold hands. It's discreet but sends the message we want them to see. Okay? Yeah, Pete nodded, taking hold of my hand in his. We can do that, can't we, babe? I was not so sure but nodded and blushed. Okay. Since we had to be on the 10.30 train the following morning, Pete headed home not much later, adding as he left, "Don't forget to wear your business suits, girls, because we're going to be doing a lot of publicity from the moment we arrive." "Yeah, we know, Pete," Sue commented. "Now bugger off and let us get some sleep. Unlike you who can roll out of bed, jump into your suit and go, we'll have to be up at the crack of dawn to get ready and be at the station on time." Just like Sue had promised, I felt like $1,000,000 when I was dressed and ready in my business suit with my hair and makeup done right unaided. With my handbag over my shoulder and a briefcase more for show than function clasped in my hand, I felt completely at ease and very grown up as we piled into the car that took us to the station. Having always traveled cattle class, first class was a revelation. We had reclining chairs in a little 4-seat bay, and had complimentary tea and coffee on call. Laughing at our saucer-shaped eyes as Pete guided us to our seats, he said, offering me the widow seat before slipping into the aisle seat beside me, "Stick with me, girls, and I'll make this seem normal." Sue nodded approvingly, slipping into the seat opposite, and said, "How you feeling, Jill?" "Great," I grinned, hushing up as the first-class attendant materialized by our bay, offering us tea or coffee. The 3-hour journey down to London passed without incident and arrived in London on time. We were met by a car from Pearson's that quickly took us to our hotel. Having to be at Earl's Court for the press opening and the official launch of Wastelands at 3 p.m., all we had time to do was check in and drop off our bags with the hotel's porters to take to our suite before we were swept off to the launch. Whispering in my ear, "Don't forget to hold Pete's hand," Sue giggled. "After all, you're a couple in love," as we walked from the hotel. I think Pete must have had some inkling of what Pearson's had planned, but Sue and I were shocked when we saw the huge publicity bandwagon that was in store for us. Arriving at the rear stage door, we were met by Mike, who, after the round of handshakes and a kiss on the cheek for Sue and I, said, "Everything's ready," and quickly led us through a maze of corridors to the Pearson's enclosure, where they had set up a stand for SR Games, which was covered in publicity boards of Wastelands. The hall was already starting to fill, and with Mike saying, "This will be your stand, where the gamers will be able to meet you on the meet and greet sessions tomorrow," only Pete had a clue what was going on. It just as well he did, because Sue and I were so far out of our comfort zone that she was as likely as I was to make a fool of herself as we were suddenly faced by a clamor of people. "Oh shit!" I mumbled as David Pearson took center stage and made a little speech about how Pearson Interactive were proud to announce the launch of SR Games' first release, Wastelands, and invited us to join him. With my hand firmly held in Pete's, I had no choice but to walk beside him as he led Sue and I onto the podium and said, "Hello everybody." After swapping a few joking pleasantry with David, he introduced Sue and I, before adding with a joking grin, "Well, this is a bit different, so please go easy on Sue and Jill, because being honest, they don't get out much." With his usual easy charm, Pete gave the waiting journalists just what they wanted, and fielding the technical questions to Sue between then, they managed to keep the questioners entertained and, more importantly, away from me. I don't really recall much of the release, as I spent the whole time terrified, as journalists shouted questions and cameras flashed. God, Jill, Sue whispered in my ear once it was over, what have we got into? After about an hour the crowd broke up, and I was finally able to relax a little, but it did not last long as we were handed over to Pearson's publicity department and their photographer. In many ways it was even worse than the bear pit of the launch, as the photographer treated Sue and I as little more than set decoration. Using the sort of patronizing language that got up Sue's nose as much as mine, he got us to pose beside Pete in some decidedly embarrassing ways, including having Pete between us with us kissing a cheek each, in front of the big SR Games, Wastelands banner. By the time the photographer was through with us I was almost in tears, and felt like his attitude had been degrading, but Sue was if anything even more upset about it than I was. The moment we were on our way back to the hotel she gave Pete a piece of her mind and really ripped into him, as she pointed out that we were not some photo whore floozies. Holding up his hands, Pete said defensively, "Look Susie, it's only publicity, and if we want to make the big leagues we need all we can get, so just suck it up and by Monday it'll be over." He was annoyingly right, and although Sue and I did not enjoy the marketing side of launching SR Games, it was pretty clear from the press reviews in the London evening papers and Computer Show supplement that his launch strategy had worked. Since Pearsons were guarding us like the crown jewels, Sue's worries about us both attracting unwanted amorous attention was unfounded, and other than when we had to do publicity appearances I enjoyed the weekend, although a lot of that might have had to do with being taken as a girl. Pretending to be Pete's girlfriend was also in its way kind of fun, although I did want to hit him when Mike said something to him over dinner that evening that made Pete laugh. That comes later, with a decidedly naughty note in his voice. Next day was more of the same, as we worked the stand. Oddly, this was something Sue and I felt more comfortable about, having sold the early version of Wastelands at computer fairs around the Northeast. There were a few times when I felt tongue-tied with embarrassment when people kept congratulating us, but having Wastelands being favorably compared to Tomb Raider was all very thrilling. The awards dinner was a stunning experience, and I felt amazing in the golden brown dress Sue had selected for me to wear, even if dancing in 3-inch heels did wreck my feet. What was even more amazing was we're nominated for the Game of the Year, and when we're with the other two finalists were stood on the podium, I was clutching Pete's hand, feeling like I was almost paralyzed with fear. Thank God we did not win, but getting a highly commended meant we were inundated with requests for interviews by the media. Hell, we even had the Sun wanting to do a photo shoot with the three of us, which Sue, bless her cotton socks, rejected, before Pearsons could twist Pete's arm. For me, the whole experience was a cross between delight and terror about how much I was enjoying being perceived as a girl. Sure, there were parts one did not enjoy that much, but overall I really enjoyed myself, and having to be Jill just added to that. I think it would be fair to say that I probably enjoyed it more than Sue did, mainly because I actually liked having to conform to all the appearance bullshit for the media and publicity that accompanied Wastelands being a success. Although I don't think Pete or any of Pearson's PR department knew it, I could tell that by Sunday evening Sue was starting to struggle with her temper, as what we were having to do publicity-wise conflicted with her feminist views. Seeing that she was like a bottle of pop ready to explode, I suggested to Pete that it might be best if Sue and I caught the early train back to Sunderland, because if the bloke from Pearson's PR called her darling or sweetheart again, she was likely to blow a gasket. Although Pete really wanted us to do another photo shoot for some magazine or other on the Monday, he recognized the signs that Sue's always volatile temper was getting to the point of blowing. Taking the bull by the horns, he quickly arranged things so he could tie up the last of the business without our presence. I'm not sure how this went down with the PR department, but to be honest, I did not care, because both Sue and I were shattered and more than a little wrung out from being in the public eye. Getting home from London exhausted, Sue and I collapsed in the front room, cradling a couple of hot chocolates, wearing our nightdresses, or rather I was. After a weekend of business suits and dresses, Sue was rebelling, most definitely a pajamas girl, I joked. You know, this week had been the first time since we've met that I've seen you wearing a dresses, Sue. Yeah, she nodded, Other than me granny's funeral, I've avoided wearing them since school, but I guess if things pan out it's something we've both got to get used to. I could see in her eyes that she was building up to something and said, "What is it, Sue? Have you thought about actually making that appointment at the hospital and seeing that gender doctor, Jill?" "Not really," I said. "Why?" "I think you should," Sue said. "You what?" "Maybe I'm wrong, but in the 3 years I've known you I don't think I've ever seen you as happy as you've been over the last few weeks or so, and it got me thinking that perhaps you should seriously consider seeing that doctor, getting the hormones and legally registering yourself a TS female." "Oh God, you're serious," I yelped. "Deadly serious," Sue said with a smile. "Look, you don't have to make up your mind just yet, but I do think it's something you should consider, because when I look at you now I just don't see Jim anymore." "Oh." "And then there is the business to think about, and given the media interest we got the weekend," Sue said, "it could well take off like David expects, and if SR Games is a success it will mean that Jim will be superfluous to requirements, as we'll have to keep Jill around." It was a lot to think about, and that night I spent a pretty sleepless night. I liked being Jim, and enjoyed the rough and tumble of male life, yet I also adored being Jill. I knew Sue was right in her estimation that if SR Games took off there would be no place for Jim in that future, and having seen and experienced over the weekend the sort of life we could leading if the sequel was a success, it was pretty clear to me that only a fool would turn down such an opportunity. In the privacy of my room I cried myself to sleep, asking myself if I was any better than one of the whores working in town, knowing that next morning I would be making the phone call.